Alright, welcome back to another video. Today I'm going to be talking about why inflation that we're seeing today is actually caused by the central banks and not by all this stuff you're hearing in the news and in the mainstream media, because that is just not true. Maybe it amplifies it, but the true root of this inflation problem is caused by the central banks. And I'm going to give 5 reasons why this is the case. So, are you ready? Let's go. So the first one on my list, of course, is interest rates at zero and quantitative easing absolutely explode. And in terms of quantitative easing, I'm actually going to show you a graph here in a minute, but it's also sometimes referred to as the expansion of the balance sheet of the Federal Reserve. Because what the Federal Reserve does when it does quantitative easing is it buys government bonds, right? It does debt monetization by buying government bonds with currency or money that did not exist before. And that is in really simple terms, printing money, right? And they did this on such a massive scale, printing trillions and trillions of dollars. You can imagine that if in combination with, in March of 2020, a GDP that went down a lot, right? Because we had COVID, right? We had the pandemic. So everyone was locked inside. Unemployment rose a lot and GDP shrank a lot. And if you have a combination where supply goes down because we're in a lockdown, right, and the pandemic hit, and when you have a situation where there's so much stimulus in the economy, and by the way, in addition to this, right, in addition to record low interest rates and quantitative easing, they also gave everyone stimulus packages. So they've created so much liquidity that if you have this combination of that much liquidity into the economy, in combination with an economy that's shrinking that much, you have such a big imbalance between supply and demand. You can imagine that that would result into higher prices. And in March of 2020 or in Q2 of 2020, and let's actually look at this graph now over here, because this shows you, you see, in Q1 of 2020, and then Q2 of 2020, which is when the recession hit, even though it was only short-lived. But this gap is so extremely wide. You can imagine that that will have an impact on inflation. And at that moment, there wasn't really that much inflation, at least in the government CPI numbers. But of course, we know that there is a lag between the printing of money and actually reaching the CPI numbers. And that is exactly what we're experiencing right now. We have extremely high inflation readings all over the board, right, in all products, in all services. And that is why it is truly a government, or not a government, but a monetary policy phenomenon. Now, the second point on my list, and this is, I think, something that most people don't realize, but it is about high inflation in Europe, but only happening in the European Union countries. So what is going on here? Well, I'm actually going to put up a chart here, or it's not a chart, it's a table actually. And what you see here is a chart of the inflation rate for every country in Europe. So not the EU, but in Europe. Now, what do we see? I can scroll down here. We see all these countries in Europe. But what surprises me is that Liechtenstein actually has the lowest inflation rate, and Liechtenstein is not part of the EU, right? They don't have the euro. Switzerland, the same, right? Extremely low inflation, and again, they don't use the euro. They are not in the European Union. The Faroe Islands, exactly the same, right? Even though inflation is 4.4%, which is, in my opinion, pretty high, but it's actually the third lowest in the entirety of Europe. And again, they are not part of the European Union. France are, of course, Malta, I think, are as well. Norway, again, very low inflation and are not part of the EU. Finland, let me check. Yeah, so Finland is part of the EU. Italy is, but then Albania, again, really low on the list, not part of the EU. And if you keep scrolling down on this list, you will see all these countries are in the EU and have extremely high inflation. So, I mean, hey, it could be a coincidence. I'm not making here a statistical analysis or something, but it is pretty weird that exactly the countries that are not in the European Union have the lowest inflation readings. It could just be a coincidence, but it's pretty weird. Now the third one on my list is that prices are going up everywhere. And it's not just, for example, with the Russia-Ukraine war right now. It's not just that the price of sunflower oil, of the price of wheat, it's not just that those prices are only going up and the rest is not. No, everything is going up in price. And if it was truly an economic shock, right? If it was truly just an imbalance between supply and demand for a few products, then sure, that could happen. Then it's not really the central bank's fault, right? It's just a certain shock to the economy. Maybe supply goes down a lot, or maybe demand goes up a lot. And that would then be an increase in certain product price, in certain prices of certain products. Now, that is not what we are seeing. Because if you look at rents, if you look at housing prices, right? If you look at energy, if you look at food prices, if you look at, I don't know, used vehicles, I mean, everything is going up. And that cannot be a coincidence. That is inflation. That is truly inflation. If you create that much currency, then that amount of currency is chasing that amount of goods, meaning that in the entire economy, you will see inflation in every product, and that's exactly what we are seeing today. Now, the fourth one on my list is the central banks admitting that they are wrong about inflation, yet they still don't do anything. And I've actually written this down here. So, for the entirety of 2021, the central banks kept saying that inflation was transitory. Then at the end of 2021, I think it was around December, they openly admitted that they were wrong. And Jerome Powell actually said, I think it is a good time to retire what we mean with transitory and explain a bit better what we mean. And Secretary of the Treasury, Janet Yellen, she agreed with that. So they openly admitted that they were wrong about inflation. And that's what I actually already predicted back in those days. So you would expect that after this public admission that they were wrong, you would expect that they are now going to do something about it, right? You're wrong, so do something about it right now. Well, they didn't. They actually kept interest rates at zero and kept doing quantitative easing. And actually, they raised interest rates on the 16th of March. So they've admitted they were wrong in December of 2021, but they only increased interest rates by the way, only 25 basis points on the 16th of March of 2022. So how does that make any sense? I just don't understand this. And actually, they also Siri. I'm not talking to you, Siri. God damn it. No, what I was saying is that they kept on doing quantitative easing up until March or April. And actually, if you look at the balance sheet, by the way, which I showed you a few minutes ago, it's actually still increasing. So they said they would stop quantitative easing in March. I think it was around March, but actually when you look at it, it's still going up. So, I mean, I don't know what they're doing over there, but kind of weird. But yeah, I mean, this again shows you how ignorant the central banks are. We should have raised interest rates, I mean, already like in April of 2020, but hey, if you have admitted that you are wrong, then do something about it. And again, they didn't, so this is another indication why inflation is caused by the central banks. Now, the last one on my list, and this is the fifth one, and it's not really a central bank thing, it's more a government thing, because it has to do with the Russia-Ukraine war. And some people say, actually a lot of people say that it's the fault of Putin, right? Biden says this, I think Elizabeth Warren also says this, right? It's the fault of Putin because he created all this inflation with all the energy prices going up and stuff. But this is just not true, right? I mean, it's not the Russia-Ukraine war that led to an increase in prices. It is the sanctions we put on Russia that led to the increase in prices, and especially in energy, right? Especially in natural gas and in oil. Now, what we would expect, if it was truly the fault of Russia that we have such a high inflation right now, what we would expect is that inflation would first be something like 2%, and then out of nowhere, because of the Russia-Ukraine war, we would suddenly have 8% inflation we have right now. Well, that is obviously not the case. We already had 7.9% inflation in February of March, and I will put up a picture here showing that. We already had 7.9% inflation year over year in February of 2022. And then in March, it was 8.5%. So that argument just doesn't hold, right? Because then we would see a sudden shock. We would suddenly see inflation going up. But that's just not the case. Inflation was already way too high. And the Russia-Ukraine war only made it worse. So, hey, I've given you a list here of 5 things regarding either the government or the central banks, showing you that it is truly a monetary phenomenon. And a lot of articles, a lot of papers, a lot of mainstream media outlets will tell you otherwise, that it's not the fault of the central banks, it's the Russia-Ukraine war, it's Putin, it's the supply chain issues, it's China, now again in lockdown with Shanghai and Shenzhen and all these cities, or that it's simply pent-up demand because of all these lockdowns, right? They will say all these sort of stuff, but I am trying to explain to you that it's not only that. I mean, sure, it has a part, sure, it doesn't help the problem, but remember that at the end of the day, inflation is always a monetary phenomenon, especially if we see it in every country in the EU and in every product we use. So yeah, that's it for today. Let me know what you think about it. Let me know what you think about inflation, and if you think that the central banks have caused inflation, or maybe it's something else. So that's it for today. Have a nice rest of your day, and I will see you in the next video. Bye bye.